Thank you for being here tonight. Chilly night, but hey, nice and warm, comfortable in here. May God bless you for coming to worship with us at the Milan Church of Christ this November Sunday evening. Well, tonight we're getting very close to wrapping up the series on the question of is it acceptable for Christians to drink alcoholic beverages, at least in moderation. Now, there are two things we need to cover before we conclude the series. Tonight we're going to look at some additional scriptures that some Christians use as possible justification for drinking in moderation. And then we also need to examine some very salient points that all Christians need to consider when it comes to the subject of drinking alcoholic beverages. So let's first take a look at those scriptures. The first one is found in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 31, verses 6 and 7. And as we look at this, we're going to look at some of the Hebrew terms, sometimes translated as wine or new wine, because that's a very important part of the study tonight. But it's interesting that Solomon here actually advises giving certain people something strong to drink. Okay, he says, give strong drink. In fact, let's just pause there. That Hebrew word for strong drink is shekar. I think that's how the Hebrews pronounce it, which always means a strong, intoxicating beverage, or beverage with a lot of alcoholic content, such as a very strong wine or other intoxicating drink. So he's advising that this should be given in this situation to him who is perishing. Perishing almost always thinks of people who are dying on their deathbed or in a lot of pain. And many people on their deathbed, especially back in those ancient times, died in a lot of pain. So it says, give them strong drink, okay? And wine to those who are bitter of heart. Now the Hebrew word for wine there, and again I'm guessing at the pronunciation, it's spelled like, but it sounds like yayin, yayin. Now yayin can refer to either wine, just fruit of the vine, grape juice, or wine that has alcoholic content. Depending on the context, that's the only way you'd figure out exactly what the Hebrew word for wine here is. But I think from this context it's clear, by wine he's talking about of the alcoholic variety. Again, give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to those who are of bitter heart. Bitter of heart typically refers to people who are bereaved, horribly bereaved from losing maybe a loved one or a child or whatever, or people who are severely depressed and maybe even thinking of taking their lives. Let him drink and forget his poverty. Poverty here does not just mean someone who's just very poor. Just look for people very poor and give them something strong to drink. No, in this context it would be someone who has just lost something or perhaps someone of great value. So feel emotionally in poverty, okay? And remember his misery no more. So Solomon absolutely here, I believe, was referring to intoxicating drinks. In fact, when he said give strong drink, he absolutely was, no doubt about it. But did Solomon in any way here condone social drinking? Obviously not. He's talking about providing relief for someone who's dying or severely depressed or bereaved. You have to remember, in Solomon's day, things like painkillers and antidepressants were non-existent. However, strong drinks were frequently used for the purposes that Solomon is discussing here. In fact, and many of you are aware of this, alcoholic beverages have been used for thousands of years as oral anesthetics when somebody was in great pain to try to dampen or diminish at least the impact of that pain in certain situations. All right, so obviously that would not apply to social drinking. Now let's examine 5 additional passages. These passages we'll go through quick, but they're all related. You'll see as we go. And some Christians use these again in an effort to justify social or moderate drinking. Okay, and by the way, what they have in common, they all refer to vineyards or grain fields that were used at times for making beverages. All right, so we go back to I'm trying to talk too fast. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 13. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 13. We'll cover 3 passages in the book of Deuteronomy. Now here Moses is giving Israel a promise. If they remain faithful to God, obedient to God. Deuteronomy 7:13, and he will love you and bless you and multiply you. He will also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your land, your grain and new wine, your oil and the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flock, in the land which he swore to your fathers to give you. Now, he's talking about God will grant you this, he'll bless your fruit of your land, your grain, and your new wine. Now, whenever you read that phrase, new wine, in the Old Testament, I can't think of an exception. There might be, but almost always, the Hebrew word there is tirash, or tarash. The word tarash always refers to grape juice. Literally means fresh juice from the grape. Okay, it never refers to alcoholic wine or any strong drink. As opposed to that other term, Hebrew term, shakar, which always means strong drink, or yayin, which can refer to either. So here, when some people would say, hey, God told Israel, he promised them, as long as you obey me, I'll bless you, so you'll have all this new wine. Well, he's talking there about grape juice. Well, some will also turn to the 11th chapter, Deuteronomy, verse 14. Deuteronomy 11:14. And again, this is a promise for Israel if they obeyed God. Then God promises, I will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, your new wine, and your oil. So you may gather in this new wine. What is this? Again, the Hebrew word is tarash, which means grape juice. And by the way, I've heard some people say, well, what is it such a big deal to drink grape juice, especially in lands where it's really hot, well, and arid? Well, let me tell you something. When I was just a youngster, I would come in during the summer from practicing baseball or whatever, and I'd be so thirsty. And the first thing I'd look for in our refrigerator was an ice-cold Pepsi or Coke. And on one occasion, I opened the refrigerator, and there was none in there. Apparently, my sister had taken it because she knew I was coming. Well, anyway, but there was a bottle of Welch's grape juice. Now, I didn't particularly care for grape juice. I didn't really drink it very much, but I thought, well, I'll try that. So I grabbed the bottle, poured a large glass full of grape juice, and I mean, that was the greatest tasting stuff, in my opinion, that day that I had ever drank when I was so hot and thirsty. Grape juice can, at times, really, really hit the spot, as they say. Okay, now moving from there, and obviously these are not referring to alcoholic wine. Chapter 33, still in Deuteronomy. Chapter 33, verse 28. Again, a promise to Israel. They'll obey. Chapter 33, 28. Then Israel shall dwell in safety. The fountain of Jacob alone in a land of grain and new wine. His heavens shall also drop dew. And again, God promised a land of new wine, that you can make all the grape juice you want. And they did, by the way. All right, let's go to Proverbs now. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. And Solomon is almost repeating the promise to all of God's people at the time he lived as king. Proverbs 3, 9 and 10. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. Grape juice. Juice squeezed from the grape. All right, so promise there, but not for anything alcoholic in nature. Someone may say, well, is there any verse in there that uses a term other than, a tirash? Well, yes. So let's look at one that David used. I'm going now to Psalms chapter 104. Psalms 104, and I'll read verses 14 and 15. Speaking of what God does for his people, and generally speaking for the world, Psalms 104, 14 and 15. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle, and vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine that makes glad the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread which strengthens man's heart. Okay, this time, The Hebrew word used is yayin. And again, yayin, when we read the word wine, the Hebrew word means alcoholic wine or grape juice. And again, you can only tell for sure by the context. The problem here is it's impossible to tell. They may have been referring to alcoholic wine here, but we just don't know for sure. So those who may use this as justification for drinking socially or in moderation, well, they just need to be a little careful because they're just assuming Dave is talking about drinking alcoholic wine. We just cannot say that for sure. All right. Now, with all those verses, there's one other thing, very important point to bring up. I would be remiss if I failed to mention what some describe as the strongest argument in favor of social drinking. What's the argument? That's the absence of any scripture that categorically condemns or prohibits drinking in moderation. And those who use that argument, they have a point. Because they're right. There is not a single verse that says you cannot, must not, will sin if you drink any, even a small amount of an alcoholic beverage. You won't find it. So it sounds like a valid justification, maybe, until you think about something. One salient point that a lot of people overlook. What if God had put that prohibition in the Bible, that specific condemnation, thou shalt not drink any beverage at all that has any alcohol in it? He could have. By some estimations, such a prohibition would have led to the premature deaths of up to 50% of early New Testament Christians. Why? Because they would have died of thirst or untreated illness if God had forbade any drinking of anything that includes any alcoholic content. Listen to me. Remember, we pointed out this before. Many people living in the days of the apostles at times and in certain locations had no choice but to drink weak wine. Very weak by today's standards, as I pointed out last week. I was talking to a minister last night, and he actually enlightened me a little more. Because he studied this subject a lot. And he said, well, actually, in the days of the apostles, he said obtaining water was not all that difficult, except in some more arid areas, like desert areas in the summer. But most Jews and most Romans and others that lived in those days could, and it might take a little footwork, but could obtain water. He said the real problem was to find safe water. Because many of the waters at those times in the streams, and even in some wells, contained parasites or bacteria, some of which were life-threatening, many of which would make a person very sick. And if a person was already compromised with his or her health, could definitely lead to their deaths. So at times, people had to drink some wine that contained alcohol. And by the way, and as I said last week, commonly it was 20 parts water to 1 part alcohol with the wine. But did you know it had just enough alcohol mixed with that water to kill many of those parasites and bacteria? That's why weak wine in many places was not only a preferred drink for the common people, but the only safe drink for a lot of people. Now think, had God said, you must not drink even that, a lot of people would have died if they obeyed that. But not to mention, many people would have gotten sick and died of illness because, remember Timothy, how he was told by the Apostle Paul, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 23, no longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your constant infirmities. Timothy, had he not taken that advice, would not have been able to travel to do any preaching at all, probably. But he was not the only one who had such an ailment. Many, many others, which I'm sure included many Christians, had such ailments that they had to treat by drinking a little wine. All right. Now, is this the only reason that God did not categorically condemn or prohibit any drinking? Only God can say that. But no one can deny the possible ramifications of such a prohibition, that it may indeed have led to the premature, the very, very early deaths of thousands of early Christians by obeying that command, if it were there. All right. Let's move on. We talked about the choices of those early Christians. Let's just expand on that a little bit. When those early Christians had some choices of what to drink, to keep from dying for thirst, what were the choices? You ever think about that? Well, those who owned or lived near wells would have some water available. And that was the best scenario, to live near a well. Because chances are you could get fairly pure water, clean water out of a well. Not always, though. Some animals would actually go down into wells and drown. And they would begin to decay and rot, and that could literally contaminate a well for an entire season at times. All right, but most of those who lived near wells did have a source of water. Others that lived near streams might have a source of safe water, depending on what was being done in the streams. And by the way, most of the streams in the days of the apostles, as you can imagine, were used to bathe in, and sadly not just bathe in. So just living near a stream did not guarantee you had safe water to drink. All right, some people own cows, or at least one cow or a goat. Thereby they would have some milk to drink, which could definitely sustain them. Wealthier people that own vineyards or fruit trees or grain fields could make a variety of beverages, including non-alcoholic beverages, and many of them did. People living in towns or in villages could purchase these very weak wines, sometimes to do so for their very survival, obviously. And wealthier people would have some choice of stronger drinks, especially for pleasurable purposes. So those were the choices. Water, when you could find it safe, milk, fruit drinks, weak wine, and strong wine or stronger drinks. Now, I want you to just imagine that compared with what we have available today, our choices. Did you know those living in the days of the apostles, if they could see a video somehow of our choices, I think they'd pass out. They'd be overwhelmed. They could not even believe that you and I could go into our house or here at the building and open a faucet and have a seemingly endless supply of water, or just press a button out on the fountain there, or hold a cup or something under that fountain and have all the cold water you'd want to drink. Or how about just going to the store and see the selection of literally hundreds of juices, flavored waters, bottled waters, soft drinks, coffees, teas, milks, nutrition drinks, and more. They wouldn't be able to fathom such a choice. In fact, they would say, you people, we, are among the most blessed people who ever lived, just because of our choices of beverages. And when we go to the store and see the choice of those beverages I've mentioned, you could purchase those and go through the checkout line and never have to worry about who might see you. Now, someone might say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, more than meets the eye. You see, one of the most important considerations for Christians when it comes to drinking, even in moderation, is our influence, our example. 100 years ago, what I'm preaching tonight would have been considered so weak, a weak sermon. I've been criticized by stronger Christians for preaching such a weak lesson. 75 years ago, it would have been considered a good lesson. 50 years ago, very good. 25 years ago, this lesson would be considered, okay, you're coming across too strong. By the way, times change, Christians shouldn't. But today, many would hear this and say, oh, you're coming across way, way too strong. Isn't that amazing how we have let sometimes time change us? And that's sad. But whether we like it or not, God holds us to a high standard when it comes to our speech, our behavior, and our habits. Now, the verses I'm about to look at are familiar to most of you, but we really need to think seriously about what God says, beginning with what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, this great Sermon on the Mount, beginning at verse 14. You, speaking to his followers, are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. In other words, you should not hide your light. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket. As our country, as was mentioned earlier, is trying to do. No, a lampstand, that it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light, something good, positive, authentically spiritual, so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. In fact, in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 23, Jesus said, if therefore the light that is in you is darkness, something that could hurt, lead people astray, how great is that darkness? You don't want to shine a dark light to anyone. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, Paul said, be an example of the believers in word, in conduct, how you live day by day, in love and spirit, in faith, in purity. When he says, be an example to the believers in conduct, he's saying avoid anything that could have a negative effect on others. Nobody could make this point more strong than the Apostle Peter. I'm reading from 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. Listen carefully. But you, Christians, are a chosen generation, chosen by God, a royal, that is kingly priesthood, a holy nation. Holy means pure, above reproach, decidedly different than what is happening and what we see in the world. That you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. We are different. The world must know that we're different. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, Peter continues along this vein. He says, beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims. That's what we are in this world. This world is not our home. We're just a passing through. Abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul. Having your conduct, that's behavior, lifestyle, listen, honorable. Honorable means above reproach, above criticism, above what people could look at you and see what you do and say, hey, they are weak. They're just like us. Above reproach. Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, when they try to accuse you of doing wrong, they may, by your good works, what they actually witness, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. That last part means by seeing your good works as opposed to you doing something that they could criticize as being wrong or sinful, that they themselves might say, you know what? I want that life. I want that salvation. Someone may say, but does my drinking a little here and there, does that make me a bad example? We'll talk about that next Sunday night, God willing. That'll wrap up our series, by the way. But I'll give you a little bit of a clue, hint. At the outset of this series, I shared this illustration. I didn't finish it, but I'll finish it now. About 45 years ago, a deacon from the Putnam City Church of Christ in Oklahoma City confided in me one afternoon. He said that at his company's annual 4th of July picnic, he said he would grab a couple of beers and drink them, ice-cold beers. He said, oh, they taste so good. And he said, now, Dennis, he said, that's the only time I ever have anything alcoholic. And then he said, now, you don't see anything wrong in that, do you? Here was my response. Do any of those people at the picnic, do they know you're a Christian? Do they know you're a deacon at the Putnam City Church of Christ? And there was a pause. And his only reply was, I see your point. I see your point. And I could almost see the wheels turning in his mind saying, now, would I be comfortable sitting down, opening a can of beer, or sipping my beer, telling someone, hey, I'm a Christian, and I'm a deacon in the Lord's church? And I could just sense, he didn't say that, but I could just sense that's what he was thinking when he said, I see what you mean. Well, God willing, we'll finish this next Sunday night. If tonight there's anybody subject to the invitation of Jesus Christ, his invitation is always open for people to come to him in faith that he's the Son of God, a willingness to repent, change for him, to do things his way, to obey God, to confess his name before others, to be baptized, immersed in water in the name of Jesus Christ. You can do that tonight if you need to, or we can pray for you if you need our prayers. All you have to do is come down when we're standing and singing.